be here in such esteemed company, and I really look forward to reading Andrew's new book, which, like Nader said, is going to be a reader on Rached Ghannouchi based on Andrew's extensive conversations about his political thought. Rached Ghannouchi, for those who are new to this conversation, is by far and away the most internationally famous of the over 24 political prisoners that Kais Saied rounded up and threw in jail this spring. Those political prisoners span Tunisia's full ideological spectrum, from so-called Islamists like Ghannouchi to anti-Islamists, opponents of Ghannouchi's political party. When Saied arrested Ghannouchi, it really marked a new step in his deepening march towards authoritarianism, in large part because it had been assumed that there was some hesitance to lock Ghannouchi up, simply because he was so famous, so internationally renowned as a quote-unquote moderate Islamist and peacemaking personality and leading Islamic political theorist. So I want to talk briefly about his youth. Then I'm going to get into the post-revolutionary period, 3 things that Rached Ghannouchi did right, 3 positives, 3 things that I think he did wrong, 3 negatives, and 2 takeaways. So a few things that we should all know about the younger Rached Ghannouchi. He held a wide variety of jobs, and he traveled widely. He lived not only in the Mashrek, in places like Syria, but he lived during his youth in France and in Germany. And he did all sorts of jobs, almost like, it reminds me of the author John Steinbeck when he was young. You know, like he was a stevedore, and he picked fruit, and you know, he studied in Syria. And I think all of these different experiences gave him a comfort with quite a lot of comfort with diversity, and a comfort in the East, in the Middle East, in the Muslim world, and in the West. He started, along with 3 other young men who were in their teens and 20s at the time, the Islamic movement that later became called Ennahda, which means the Renaissance or the rebirth, in the early 1970s. And this movement was loosely inspired by the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but it was certainly not like the local Tunisian franchise version of that. It had other inspirations too, like Malik bin Nabi, the Algerian, more secular thinker, his political thought. And it defined itself as being very anti-Bourguiba. Bourguiba at the time was the so-called enlightened authoritarian who was leading Tunisia, but the young men who built Ennahda, and the women too, there was never a gender segregation in the movement like there was in Hassan al-Banna's Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood in the 20s and 30s. These young men and women in the 1970s really defined the movement as being pro-democracy and anti-authoritarianism. So they were looking at Tunisia's political ailments through the lens of religious conservatism, but they believed very strongly in debate, in pluralism. Like I said, there was never gender segregation within Ennahda, and they believed in working with everyone. So in Ennahda's first press conference in 1981, they said that we're more than happy to work with communists, with the Tunisian Communist Party against Bourguiba's dictatorship. A lot of so-called Islamist parties around the Muslim world at the time said, what, you're going to talk with communists? How is that Islamic? So Ennahda got a lot of criticism starting in the 1970s and 80s from more radical, more religiously conservative Islamist movements across the region because of this commitment to democracy and pluralism. It deepened that commitment during the 2000s under Ben Ali's dictatorship, during cross-ideological opposition talks that Ennahda participated in, along with leaders of secularly oriented movements in Tunisia at the time. And it committed, it actually signed on the dotted line. Leaders of Ennahda, including Ghannouchi and his representatives, I should say, signed on the dotted line, saying that the sole source of a government's legitimacy in Tunisia is the people. It's not Sharia, like Andrew was saying. Ghannouchi had a strong commitment, theoretically, through Islamic arguments to popular sovereignty and the ballot box. So let's get to the post-revolutionary, post-2011 period. 3 things that Ghannouchi did right and 3 things that I think that he did wrong. One thing he did right was he exercised a lot of self-restraint in the construction of Tunisia's democratic institutions and in Ennahda's role in power. even before 2011, when he was living in exile in the UK, and scholars, including the late Alfred Steppen, interviewed Ghannouchi about what kind of electoral system do you think Tunisia should have if it ever becomes a democracy. He endorsed the electoral system that would have hurt Ennahda the most, assuming that Ennahda was going to be the most popular party in any democratic elections. He endorsed proportional representation with hair quota, which is great for small parties and really bad for big ones. And that's ultimately what he endorsed in 2011 after the revolution too, because he said Islamist parties or religiously conservative parties can lose by winning in the Middle East and North Africa because they spook people. Look at what happened to Algeria in the early 1990s. Look at what happened in Tunisia in the early 1990s. We need to exercise self-restraint. Now, Ghannouchi's critics accused him of a double discourse and wanting to gradually gobble up democratic institutions, but he was very consistent about that before and after the revolution. And there were a number of decisions that Ennahda made, such as stepping down from power peacefully in 2014 when there was a lot of protest against their rule, that also manifested that commitment to taking a pretty minimalist approach in power. The second thing I think Ghannouchi did right, he led a series of pragmatic compromises after the 2011 revolution. In fact, under Ghannouchi's leadership, Ennahda gave up so much that some of its members accused it of almost radical pragmatism, of almost behaving like a self-emasculating giant. Ennahda had the most votes, more votes than any other political party after 2011, but it kept giving things up. So I'll just run through a quick list of those. It gave up any mention of Sharia in the constitution, Tunisia's first democratic constitution, which was passed under Ennahda's leadership in 2014. It gave up criminalization of blasphemy. It gave up the first draft of an article that was quite problematic in the beginning that said men and women complement each other within the family. It gave that up almost immediately when there was pushback. More problematically, perhaps, Ennahda gave up meaningful transitional justice, and it gave up meaningful pursuit of security sector reform because it was really afraid of institutional and deep state backlash. Ennahda also gave up a lustration law, proposed lustration law in 2014 that would have made it impossible for members of the former regime who held high positions, including the then most popular presidential candidate, Beji Qaeda Sebsi, to run in elections. Ennahda gave that up. That was hugely controversial. Ghannouchi had started off supporting it, but he ended up abandoning his support for that article, which helped Tunisia's democratic transition survive. He also gave, along with other Ennahda leaders, a lot of unelected political parties disproportionate say in the drafting of Tunisia's 2014 constitution. So again, that minimalism and self-restraint. Those are just a few. That's by no means an exhaustive list. And a third thing that Ghannouchi did right after 2011, he led negotiation efforts that had a moderating influence domestically and regionally. So in 2012 and 2013, he would make trips to Egypt to try to talk sense into Mohamed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood's president at the time, and try to get Mohamed Morsi to see the wisdom of making these sorts of pragmatic compromises and stepping down from Morsi's tougher Islamist approach. He also he was the key figure that broke the logjam during the 2013 Bardo crisis that almost sunk Tunisia's entire democratic transition. He initiated contact with Beji Qaeda Sebsi at the time, and their behind-the-scenes talks in France opened the door to the quartet that ultimately won the 2015 Nobel Peace Prize. That started with Ghannouchi. Let's get into what he did wrong. This kind of helps answer Nader's question a bit. 3 things that he did wrong. I think Ghannouchi, first and foremost, succumbed to the tragedy of longevity. During Ghannouchi's youth, he understood himself to be the anti-Bourguiba, against Bourguiba's paternalistic authoritarianism. But the older Ghannouchi got, the more he wanted to stay in power. And he didn't retire. So starting in 2016 at that famous Ennahda 10th Party Congress, you started to see Ghannouchi try to isolate democratic debate and vibrant contestation within Ennahda. A lot of people within the party accused him of creeping authoritarianism within the party and of not making enough space for young people, new leaders to emerge and refresh the party's leadership. one of the members of Ennahda who actually helped found Ennahda all the way back in the 70s and then left the party said that Ghannouchi could never escape the little Bourguiba in his head. He started in some ways to become what he hated. Just in terms of wanting to have so much power within Ennahda. And then the second thing he did wrong, I think, is tied to that. He made a very questionable decision in 2019 to seek a seat as a member of parliament. Now, Ghannouchi looked at the polls like everyone else, and he knew that he was one of the most loathed figures in Tunisian politics, often for unfair reasons. People made all these unfair accusations that he was supporting jihadism. There was no evidence for that, etc. But rightly or wrongly, he was a very unpopular figure in Tunisian politics, but he didn't really care. He decided that he wanted to put his face front and center and become Speaker of Parliament anyway. And that helped create a stage on which a lot of populist anti-system actors could make big scenes and turn the parliament into a circus and delegitimize the work of parliament. And that's ultimately what happened. Ghannouchi is not first and foremost responsible for those bad actors, but his lack of wisdom in not knowing when to quit, not knowing when to retire, maybe write some more books that Andrew could interview him about, spend time with his grandkids, helped set that stage. I think a third thing that he arguably did wrong after 2011 is he sought consensus so much that it started to look to a lot of Tunisians like Ennahda cared more about holding on to their seats than delivering on a vision for Tunisia or delivering on any concrete reforms for the country. So I think what helped Tunisia survive the first stage of its transition, and where Ghannouchi really shone at his brightest, prioritizing consensus, pragmatic self-restraint, making all these compromises, wheeling and dealing with Beji Caid Essebsi. In the second phase of Tunisia's transition, especially after 2015, 2016, those started to become liabilities, not assets. And Ghannouchi had trouble making the pivot. So two takeaways, and I'll finish here. The imprisonment of Rached Ghannouchi is not justifiable under any argument. Ghannouchi was flawed and fallible. Of course, he was not a perfect leader. He did a lot of things right. I think he did more right than he did wrong. But some of those things that he got wrong did end up weakening Tunisia's democratic system and weakening internal democracy within Ennahda. But his imprisonment is very dangerous, in part because it empowers extremists. It vindicates the argument that the ballot box in the Middle East and North Africa is a futile pathway to change. So for authoritarians in the region who make that case, and for jihadist recruiters who make that case, the imprisonment of Rached Ghannouchi is a gift, because it teaches a lot of onlookers that you can be the most moderate, diluted, watered down so-called Islamist party. You can sacrifice all of your Islamism and you can make loads and loads of compromises one after another, but you're still going to get locked up. So what's the takeaway there? Well, what's the point of all this politics, of all this compromise? And that's a very, very dangerous lesson. Another thing I want listeners to take away is that Said is the inverse of Rached Ghannouchi when it comes to his level of Islamism. Ennahda is often, I think, wrongly understood to be an Islamist party, and Rached Ghannouchi is often, I think, wrongly understood to be an Islamist leader. In fact, Kais Saied, the current president of Tunisia, is infinitely more Islamist than either Ghannouchi or Ennahda. I'll give you some examples. Not only does Said rail against the West all the time, which is something that Ghannouchi really never did at any point in his history, Kais Saied self-authored a constitution that he ramrodded through via an undemocratic referendum last summer. Article 5 of that self-authored constitution promises that the Tunisian state will, quote, work to achieve the objectives of pure Islam. So for the first time in Tunisia's history, the Tunisian state is tasked with achieving the objectives of pure Islam. Had Ennahda even whispered about that behind closed doors, it would have caused a furor in Tunisian society and in international press, certainly in Western press. But Said did it. He not only talked about it, he did it. Another way that Said is more Islamist than Ghannouchi supported decriminalizing homosexuality. He didn't have necessarily a fully liberal approach, to say the least. Ghannouchi was a supporter of don't ask, don't tell, basically. But Ghannouchi has on the record, speaking with French journalists and others in Tunisia, has said repeatedly that he wanted homosexuality to be decriminalized. Whereas Kais Saied has repeatedly called gay people deviants and fully supports the criminalization of homosexuality. Kaya Syed also supports unequal inheritance for women, whereas Ghannouchi and Ennahda were supporting tacitly behind the scenes efforts to remake Tunisia's inheritance law along more egalitarian lines. I've interviewed Bouchra Belhaj Hamida, probably the most famous feminist in Tunisian politics, and she's told me that Ghannouchi and Ennahda had told her that if so-called secular parties took the lead on Beji Qaida Sebsi's proposed inheritance reform, that Ennahda was prepared to put its weight behind it. Whereas Kaya Syed fully supports unequal inheritance for women. There's all sorts of other examples too, but I'll leave it at that.